This week I thought we would say goodbye to friends of the channel Steve Reed and Daniel Zeichner, who have been evicted from their roles as Environment Secretary and Farming Minister. So we'll talk about that and the new ministers, who I thought got off to a sterling start as this article hit the BBC saying thousands of nature payments had been cut. But upon reading a little further, I don't actually think this is anything new. And I've had a few chats with civil servants from the Treasury over the past few months, so I wanted to take a moment to discuss the relationship between the Treasury and the rest of government, because I'm increasingly of the belief that DEFRA has no agency whatsoever. So this week we said goodbye to Steve Reed, who I have seen speak twice. Both times I thought he seemed out of his depth, and he seemed to think it was unfair people were asking him tough questions, so he became increasingly irritable and red in the face. There was also a brief moment in the examination schools of Oxford University after he spoke in January where he was being escorted out of the building just as I was dashing out of a different room to talk to the press. So just for a fleeting couple of seconds we were both stood at the top of the grand staircase staring at each other with contempt. I don't think he knew who I was. He's just a very contemptuous human being. At any rate, he's now enthusiastically accepted his new role as Housing Minister, echoing the Trumpian proclamation, "Drill, baby, drill," with his starkly uncreative new slogan, "Build, baby, build." Nevertheless, he takes with him to his new role an unshakable air of mediocrity.
An entire generation locked out of home ownership. Not anymore. For too many families, the dream of home ownership is just that, a dream. I will leave no stone unturned to build the homes our country desperately needs. We'll get spades in the ground, cranes in the sky, to get the key to home ownership in your hand. I will unleash the biggest era of house building in our country's history. Let's build, baby, build.
We will, I think, keep a loose eye on Steve Reed going forward because he talked a lot about nature. That was one of his 3 key principles of farming, and he went to groundswell and all that. But the reason he's Rachel Reeves' favourite minister is precisely because he's prepared to water down environmental regulations to build more houses.
Who has been the standout cabinet minister in the first year of the Labour government? Present company accepted, obviously.
I think Steve Reed, environment, is brilliant. He is a sort of an unsung hero, but to do things like build homes, we've got to change the environmental regulation. We've got to change the planning system so we can actually get those homes built. We've got to, build reservoirs in our country again if we're going to build more housing, and he's doing all of those things. So I think he's excellent.
And as we've talked about before, the government are changing the compulsory purchase legislation to force people off land they own, compensating them only for the current use value, which, if agricultural, is far less than the market value of the land. So people will lose their farms and not be able to buy another equivalent farm with the compensation. I'm sure Steve Reed will take great pleasure in ejecting workers from the land now he has gotten to know our rural communities over the last year. I don't think anyone was sad to see Steve Reed go, but people were sad to see the back of Daniel Zeichner, the farming minister, who had been the shadow farming minister for 5 years before Labour won power. He was seen to be someone who would listen and actually empathise with the plight of those working the land. My perception of Daniel Zeichner is that there is some truth in that. I think he knew that pursuing growth by forcing land sales through an unpayable tax that could only be avoided in many cases through suicide was wrong. But I don't share the sympathy many have for him, because he went to the House and wrote in the press defending those measures. And for defending the party line, despite the awful effects it was having on the people that he governed, he has been returned to the backbenches, which I think is well deserved. Zeichner has been replaced as the farming minister by Angela Eagle, who the opposition were quick to point out has only mentioned the word farming 3 times in Parliament since she was first elected in 1992. And Steve Reed has been replaced by the 10th DEFRA secretary in 10 years, Emma Reynolds, who up until the election last year was working as a lobbyist for the financial sector, trying to convince the government not to put China on the naughty list. So she seems to have little or no interest in any of the issues under DEFRA's brief, but is probably quite interested in GDP growth. And accordingly, my take on this is that it doesn't really matter, because I don't think DEFRA make any meaningful decisions. And I say this because last week I went to a academic workshop conference thing in York about rural history. And it was attended by someone from the Treasury who was very well versed in agricultural economics. And he said he watched my broadcasts, which I thought was funny. The man from the Treasury was very nice in talking to me at length about the economics of all this, which is of course not my home territory, but because he was so nice, I won't go into too many details. But there were a couple of broad points made that I think are public anyway, and I wanted to discuss them. The first one I put to you all as a question. I don't know the exact years in question here, but over a given period since the Second World War, the number of dairy farmers in this country declined by 70%, but the production of milk went up by 4%. This means the total factor productivity, the efficiency with which labour and capital is converted into output, increased a great deal. Milk production became more efficient in terms of the labour employed. And this could be taken to mean that as farmers leave the industry or are forced to leave through the inheritance tax, agricultural production in this country could become more efficient, cheaper, more competitive. My farm is an example of this. We used to employ 2.5 people, and when we stopped milking a few years ago, those jobs stopped because the cows went to other farms. Given it's unlikely the farms buying our cows took on more labour to deal with them, the amount of labour in dairy production in this country declined slightly when we stopped milking. But because the cows just moved elsewhere, production probably more or less stayed the same. But I'm not sure total factor productivity is a very good metric in considering these issues. If you had a system in any industry that was deemed to be inefficient in terms of total factor productivity, but produced cheap stuff for output and provided lots of jobs, those people working the jobs would earn money and spend it, which would then make the economy go. So again, on my farm today, you could argue total factor productivity is much better than it was when we were milking, because our tractors are very small, which means we have contractors do most of the work. These machines are huge, so they can cultivate our entire farm in a bit over a day. While this might be better for total factor productivity, I think this is probably worse for the economy as a whole than when we were dairy, because we're moving a lot less money around. We're not buying lots of machinery, we're not selling lots of milk, and we're not paying people wages. And although it's not very much, we do make more money now than we did when we milked, which means this transition away from intensive agriculture and employing people, for us as a family, has been economically rational. So to an economist, on a micro scale, it's been a good thing. We are better off now we have stopped milking. And then on a macro scale, total factor productivity of dairy production nationally may have improved as we stop milking, just as the total factor productivity on our land, as we have to pay contractors to do min-till work, has probably increased. There's less labour involved in working this land now than there was 8 years ago. But I'm just not convinced that is a good thing. And also with all of this, you have to square it with good agricultural practice. And if you can graze dairy cows in the summer, it is quite efficient in terms of labour, because you only have to milk them for a couple of hours at each end of the day. Whereas a massive dairy unit that has too many cows to graze relies on silage all year, which means making more silage and putting out rations in the summer. Call me a dirty lefty, but surely jobs, although they might be bad for total factor productivity, are quite good for the economy. But I present this as a question. Is total factor productivity a reasonable metric? I don't know. Other things I learnt is that the Treasury aren't really sure the NFU's proposals about taxing land sales rather than interrupting functioning businesses with inheritance tax would raise more money for the government, which I'm sure is incorrect, but it indicates that as an industry, we're not cutting through particularly on messaging. I also bumped into a Treasury civil servant in a London pub after the NFU conference, and one of the difficulties I have in talking to them is that, like all farmers, I am trying to defend a vision of the countryside that stems from British post-war socialism and latterly European social democracy. Farming as we know it was preserved by the post-war consensus enacted by the Socialist Labour Party with the 1947 Agriculture Act. And this preservation continued through the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy. But very few people, even on the left, still see the world through the lens that produced those politics. The civil servants I've spoken to seem to have absolutely swallowed neoliberalism as an ideology. And of course, neoliberalism is a perfectly legitimate ideology, as much as I dislike it. But the problem lies in the fact that they seem not to be aware that it is an ideology. They see it as a brute fact. It's just how things are. Total factor productivity is more important than creating jobs or facilitating good mixed farming on a business level. So if in conversation with them I question the value of total factor productivity, they think I'm some sort of alien. It's very difficult to navigate. Mixed farming of animals and crops in one rotation is of course inherently not as specialised as it could be. So the very fact that that style of agriculture was promoted after the Second World War shows that they didn't think total factor productivity was very important back then. At any rate, it seems to me the macroeconomics of the countryside, as seen by the Treasury, dictates what DEFRA does. We've talked about this before. And I understand Steve Reed didn't agree with the inheritance tax and also wasn't told about it until the last minute before it was announced. Accordingly, some people, like Dr. Clive Black, have called for DEFRA to be abolished. This was said at the Save British Farming press event earlier this year, and it wasn't something I had ever considered, but the useful stuff DEFRA does is animal health management and such, which doesn't really require a minister, so maybe we should be pushing for some structural change. If DEFRA isn't going to formulate some sort of long-term agricultural or environmental policy and defend that against the people at the Treasury, then it does seem superfluous. But anyway, this week's big news to welcome in the new ministers is that the Countryside Stewardship has had some payments cancelled. Upon reading into this further, I don't think it's actually a new revelation, but refers to the fact countryside stewardship schemes are being phased out, and the sustainable farming incentive that is replacing it doesn't include many options available for hill farmers, which is a type of farming we did a series on earlier this summer. Although I think this is a shame, it doesn't come as a surprise to me because, as I say every video, Zeichner told us not to expect government support in the future. And he did what the Treasury told him to do, and the Treasury is still the Treasury. In this video, as some of you will remember, I got out of my pram a little bit to make the point that the government were just using appeals to nature as political cover to remove the food subsidies. They're not going to keep paying us for nature because you can't monetize nature in a conventional economic system. At the same time, they're trying to force people off land with inheritance tax in pursuit of total factor productivity. To also be subsidising those people for wildflower patches would be nonsensical. How do you improve the total factor productivity of nature? To finish off, we're going to London on Wednesday to oppose an American free trade agreement coinciding with Trump's visit. This is because one of the key justifications for the inheritance tax and the withdrawing of government support for agriculture is the fact that we are only 77% self-sufficient in foods that we can produce here, which means the government are throwing money at us, but agricultural prices on the consumer end are just dictated by the world markets. And this is something that will not change if they allow tariff-free imports of cheaper American food. This means in our campaigning we have to close that door and stop them doing an American free trade agreement. Then they're going to have to come up with a food plan that involves British production, at which point the inheritance tax becomes completely unreasonable. So here is the advert I've made for it, but we'll talk about it a bit more next week. Do subscribe, and I will see you on the other side. On the 17th of September, Save British Farming are going to Westminster to oppose an American free trade agreement. It is essential that as farmers we oppose cheap imports to undermine the government's current food plan. We'll start with the inheritance tax legislation. It says key aspects of UK food security include prices and physical availability, and changes to inheritance tax reliefs are not expected to have a material impact on either. This is because UK agricultural prices, including for domestic production, are typically a function of international prices. Changes to inheritance tax reliefs would not be expected to impact the UK's ability to source imports from international markets. So the government thinks that the effect of the inheritance tax on farmers doesn't matter because we can source food from abroad. British farming doesn't matter, and accordingly, Starmer has signed an agreement with the Americans that they consider to be quite favourable.
I like your Prime Minister. He's slightly more liberal than I am, as you've probably heard, but he's a good man. He got a trade deal done. And, they've been working on this deal for 12 years. He got it done.
But because of the allowed American imports of bioethanol, tariff-free, into this country, the Vivergo fuel plant has closed, which means we no longer have the floor it provided in the wheat price. Starmer did this deal with a statutory instrument in such a way that Parliament couldn't scrutinise the deal, and it bypassed the democratic process, which is deeply alarming. And Trump's tariffs are also impacting the price of other commodities, hitting malting barley in particular. This is just the beginning. The damage we are already seeing is from a relatively limited set of measures. It's not yet a full free trade agreement. We must stop that from happening. As we have done before, the Conservatives pursued an American free trade agreement which was stopped by banging on about food standards. Chlorinated chicken. This is less divisive than the inheritance tax as a campaigning point because it's about the consumer and it allows us to unite with Labour's base so they can't ignore us. And if we can stop an American free trade agreement by mobilising the public against substandard food, they will have to come up with a food plan involving British production, which will mean rethinking the inheritance tax as they won't be able to rely on cheap imports. Some people have been saying the problem is not Trump but our own government. Perhaps that is the case. We are going to Westminster on the 17th of September to shout at them. There's space for tractors around Parliament Square. Do come along. The march starts at about 5 p.m. I'll see you there.